Well, it's an oldie where I come from. I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet.
Put your hands together for Frishberg. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to close out the first day of Interact London 16. I'm going to keep my introduction relatively short. You can read about my bio in the program. You can look me up on Google. But suffice it to say, I have about 30 years of experience in design. I started my design career as an architect, building architect, moved into UX design and strategy. Most recently, I completed a book in which I was responsible for most of the design as well as the authorship. So, see if I can get this to work here. Hello? Oh, we have to turn it on. Let's try that. Technology. You want to show me what's happening here?
I was going to say architects.
Yeah. All right. It's okay. I can. Huh? I'll just deal. Let's see if I can deal. There we go. So, I have one point to make today I want to leave you with, and that is our job as designers is not to predict the future. Our job as designers is to create the future and invent it. And what I'm going to give you is a tool for those of you who are doing design to improve the odds of inventing futures that are positive and desirable. So that's it. Keynotes are supposed to be simple. That's pretty much going to be it. I'll offer you the tool, give you a little theory to help substantiate that tool, show you some examples of it, and then give you some implications for your design practice about when you apply that tool. About 35 years ago, I was at a family dinner sitting next to my great uncle Abe, who we called Grandpa Abe. So it was about 1982. He was 95 at the time. And he turned to me and he said, "Do you think I should buy an IBM PC?" And I was delighted that he should even know what one was, let alone consider owning it. And we discussed it, and we agreed that probably for what he was doing in his life in that time, that kind of power tool didn't make much sense. And the conversation turned to some of the technology that he'd experienced in his 95 years. And he said he was a traveling salesman. His territory was from the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Minnesota, a state in the northern part of the Midwest of the United States, up to Fargo, North Dakota. And that is an illustration of his journey that he would take by horse. And what he said is that the biggest impact on his life technologically was the invention of the Model T Ford. Now you got to remember, this guy saw airplanes, cinema, blenders. I mean, he'd seen a lot of different technology, but the Model T, he said, was the biggest technological impact on his life because it extended his sales range. He was a haberdasher. He sold men's and women's clothing. It extended his range by 2 months. And that's how he put it. He couldn't see any reason to go further north or west than Fargo. There was nothing that direction. And so he could leave the Twin Cities a little later, and he could spend more time on the road, and spends more time in Fargo and get back roughly at the same time that it used to take him with a horse. Because in that part of the world at that time, you didn't want to be caught out in the snow. In mid-October, when the snow flew, he needed to be back in the Twin Cities. I thought, that's great. That's cool. And he said, you know, one of the standard maintenance on the Model T was that every 20 miles you had to take the head cover off and scrape carbon off the pistons. And that was a head scratcher for me back then, and I said, wow, I'm surprised that anybody put up with that. And he said, compared to a horse, that was nothing. Now, I tell you that story for several reasons. One, I like it. It's nice to tell stories about our ancestors, and it's true. It happens to be a true story, so I like that. Two, it's really easy to tell stories about technology that's already happened. That kind of sounds even stupid that I have to say that, but the fact is we have eyewitness accounts, we have documentation, we know about Ford's sales figures, we know all sorts of things about the Model T. And so it's relatively easy to tell true stories about technology that's already happened. And the third reason that I tell you that story is that if you were riding beside Grandpa Abe in his Model T, neither of you in 1912 could ever have predicted the impact of that technology on our economy, on our culture, or our environment. Now, it turns out that the Model T and the IBM PC had very interesting parallel relationship. The Model T turned out to be an open technology platform. You could pop the rear wheels off, put on winches and saws and other tools on that back axle, and it became a very valuable tool for farmers. And of course, the IBM PC was an open source, if you will, technology platform that allowed for all sorts of innovation. Now, in 1982, Moore's Law was 20 years old already, and the IBM PC was perfectly on schedule with respect to the doubling of gates every 18 to 24 months. Now, that little postage stamp red figure below the IBM PC is the Cray XMP, which was the fastest computer, supercomputer on the planet in 1982. And everybody knew in 1982 that today we would have access to supercomputers hundreds of times more powerful than the Cray. Because that was a matter of engineering and math, assuming that Moore's Law continued, and there was no reason to think it wouldn't because they'd already had experience for 20 years with it. It was a relatively easy formula and equation to carry forward into the future. But in 1982, nobody could have predicted the impact of this set of supercomputers that we are holding in our hands on our environment, our economy, or our culture. In fact, nobody even talked about us holding them in our hands in 1982. So I submit that it is a fool's errand to try to predict the future. Instead, I'm going to suggest we don't have to. Instead, this tool I'm going to offer you today is a bit of a hack. I'm going to suggest that the future is already here. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. And that you're really going to be involved in something of a scavenger hunt in looking for that future. I have a small confession to make, so I'd prefer that you don't tweet this. because I haven't shared it with a lot of people. Which is why I did not share it with Carrie during Lou's exercise this morning, because I do have a superpower. And perhaps one of the reasons that I think about the future as an elegant scavenger hunt is because my superpower is I can see the future. Now, I discovered that several years ago. I thought everybody could see the future, and it was shocking when I realized that most people can't. So, for me, the future is here. It's just a matter of finding it. Now, one of the things that comes with a superpower is a super weakness. And so I have a super weakness that goes with this. I can see the future, but sadly, I'm always wrong. And the problem is that I'm wrong in two dimensions. I am wrong on all sorts of, breadth, like I don't know which part of the future I have wrong. And I'm wrong in terms of quantity. I don't know how close to correct I am or how far off I am. So it's a very frustrating superpower. And so I created this tool to help me overcome that weakness, which I'm going to share with you today in a moment. I think we would all agree, I hope we would all agree, that one of the definitions of design is creating the future. I hope that most of us, I think, are designers in the room if I saw the hands earlier. And this is the typical sort of rendition of the future, a road or a stream, a time stream going out in front of us. And one of the things that we do as designers is project ourselves into that future. So if you are an interaction designer, you have to project yourself 5 seconds into the future in order to get through that next micro interaction. And if you're creating a new society, you need to think about constitutions and how to author those so that that society can last hundreds of years. That's hard. And it takes courage. And the reason it takes courage is that not a lot of people can come with you on that journey. You need to bring that stuff back. And you need to help your client do what's in their best interest, because we can't bring them along necessarily with us. And that takes a lot of courage to help your clients see the world as it might be coming up. I think almost all human beings have that capacity to project themselves into the future. We couldn't make dinner, for example, if we didn't have that ability to plan and imagine what that needed to be. But there are very few dinners I can think of that take courage to design. There are some, state dinners being some of them, I'm sure. So I want you to think about the future a little differently. I want you to think about your work as designers as time travel. That you actually are traveling into the future in time. And as a traveler, you are bringing with you the traveler's notebook, because any good traveler keeps a journal. And so you have in your hands, in your design journals, and in your whiteboards, and in your studios, the time traveler's notebook. And I want you to start thinking about those sketches that you're doodling with and working with as glimpses into the future. So I've talked with many of you today, and I'll hopefully have a chance to talk with a few of you tomorrow as well. I don't know all of your situations, but I have found myself in the last 15 years in organizations that don't understand design. They look at designers as people with funny hair and funny shoes. They don't have a vocabulary for design. There's no organizational structure for design. And I was just mentioning to some folks today, I don't know why I keep doing that to myself. I don't know why I keep finding myself in these organizations. But I'm usually the first designer in those organizations. And so there are some days in the morning in which I have had enough teachable moments to call it quits for the week, because I am constantly trying to inform my cohort, whether they're management or team members or peers, about how design is going to have a positive impact on the outcome of their work. So if I get a little professorial in the next couple of minutes, let's blame it on my job, because I feel compelled to give you some theory that'll underscore this tool that I've hinted at. And so we'll put you through that. Now, in order to give you this theory, I'm going to make up a word. This is a word you've never heard before, and I know you've never heard of it because I just made it up. And it's a word that sounds like another word that I think you may be familiar with. And the word you're familiar with, I hope, is anachronism. An anachronism is something that's out of time. It's an object or person that's in the wrong time. So you might be looking at a black and white classic movie from the 30s, and unfortunately they put a phone from the 50s in there. That would be an anachronism. The word I'm going to offer you today, however, is idochronism. An idochronism is an artifact from the future. Idochronology is the study of those artifacts or the practice of using those artifacts. And I want you to think about idochronology as future archaeology. Idochronisms have this set of characteristics that you need to know about, and I'll share those with you. The first one is that they are naturally ambiguous. When you look at these idochronisms, they shift like these classical optical illusions. Sometimes you see foreground, sometimes you see background. So this is true of idochronisms. The second principle is that they must be viewed through the cultural lens of their time. And so when we look at these idochronisms through our current cultural lens, it's uncomfortable. They don't make sense. We were talking at dinner last night, and somebody said they didn't particularly care for the movie Citizen Kane, considered one of cinematography's greatest thing, greatest production. And the question then comes up, why? Well, the pacing, it's a very slow movie. When viewed through our cultural lens, that movie appears inappropriate. But when viewed through the lens of the 40s or 30s when it was produced, it was a very powerful movie. So idochronisms have to be viewed through the cultural lens of their time. And the third principle is, when these things come back from the future and land in your notebooks and whiteboards and studios, they get transformed. You cannot tell by inspection what their actual form looks like. A button might have melted into a display. A handle might have fallen off. This stuff gets ruined as it comes back through time. You can think about it as this bright, shiny object in the future, and as it starts to move towards us and appears in our notebooks, things get ruined. But two things stay with it, no matter what. The first is the problem that it was meant to solve in the future. That stays with it. And the second is its meaning. So when you look at these idochronisms, you know that the problem it's trying to solve and its meaning has remained coherent. Your challenge is to discover what those are. Now, we walk out of this theater into the museum at large, and we accept these artifacts from the past, and yet they have exactly the same characteristics as idochronisms. They are ambiguous, they must be viewed through the cultural lens of their time, and they have clearly been transformed as they've moved through time. So we can accept these as real objects. And archaeologists and anthropologists spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the meaning of these things were to the culture of their time. So I'm asking you to take that same cognitive lens to the sketches that are in your notebooks. And it's very important for this tool to work for you to believe that they are truly artifacts from the future. Now, go back to that opening clip. Marty McFly unintentionally offered an idochronism to the prom-goers when he rendered Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good in the way he did. Up until the moment they heard those notes, it was merely an improvisational riff that he was having fun with. But as soon as they heard that thing, it became an idochronism. And so merely looking at the sketches in your notebooks and whiteboards and so forth is insufficient for you to know what is the meaning and the problem associated with those idochronisms. They are proto-idochronisms. You need to actually turn them into idochronisms by offering them to an audience. And I say he did it unwittingly because if he had known that was going to be their reaction, he may not have had the courage to actually do it. Because it takes a lot of courage to do this. Imagine, I think back to my first design critique, when my professors and my peers took my design apart, and I wondered why I was getting into this profession, because it was so painful. And yet, we sign up to do that every day. Now imagine that you offer your sketches in raw form to users and wait for the wild ride that comes. Okay. So before I kind of give you some examples of how this works, I'm going to do a very quick academic review, because the offering of artifacts to users as a means of understanding them, not the artifacts, but the users, has a long-standing tradition in the academy. And it actually started at Imperial College, just a little ways away from here in the 60s, with the introduction of design research. Specifically, design research was an inquiry into how we design, so that we could become better designers and others could become better designers. More recently, in the last 15, 20 years, it's expanded its remit so that it is now about using design to drive research. Kind of flipped it. At the same time, in the 60s, the emergence of the neo-futurist movement with Archigram, here Ron Heron's sketch of a future artifact of a future city, the moving city, was offered to museum goers as a proposal for what might happen as this army of robotic cities travels across the land, occupying villages for some period of time and leaving deposits of high-tech connectivity behind. This is back in the 60s. Similarly, Super Studio, a sort of visionary architecture studio of the time, was reflecting on super-consumerism and super-production and super. And they were starting to talk about what would that mean if we took those cultural memes and those cultural themes and pushed them into the future. These artifacts were offered not with the intention of that future actually coming into being, but to have a conversation today about what is important in our culture. In 1999, sort of design research and the use of artifacts to drive research was probably best featured by Bill Gavers and Tony Dunn's and Elena Pacenti's seminal article on cultural probes. And some of you may have already used cultural probes in your practice. But the process is quite simple. You identify an audience, a group of folks you're interested in learning more about, and you give them various objects. In this case, it might be a postcard with a surreal image on it. And you ask them, you might give them a stack of these and some other things, and you ask them over a course of time to write their thoughts about what this image means and mail it back. This is pre-digital. And the purpose of cultural probes was to inspire design teams to think about interesting problems. So the purpose of offering these artifacts was to actually create inspiration. And I don't know if you've read Nathan and Christopher's book, but it's an excellent treatise on Hollywood's creation of very high-resolution artifacts from the future, not for the purposes, well, for the purposes of suspending our disbelief about those futures. And the authors go into a sort of taxonomy of these interesting interfaces that keep cropping up time and time again. Brain-mind interfaces and touch panels and so forth. But again, these artifacts are not intended to do anything other than help create an immersive narrative for the movie. Now, one of the interesting side effects of that particular artifact from the future is that current-day engineers and designers are often inspired by these visions of the future, and they end up trying to make them. The most classic example is the Nike Mag from Back to the Future 2 and Nike's recent introduction of the HyperAdapt 1.0, both of which are self-lacing tennis shoes. Of course, Nike took 20 years to build that thing based on that. So those are not idochronisms. And I'll nearly finish with this theory for a second. Tony Dunn goes off with Fiona Raby, does this wonderful book on speculative design, which is a reflection on the neo-futurist movement in which these very highly resolved artifacts are brought into the gallery of an alternative future, some of them quite dystopic and disturbing. Again, not for the purpose of creating that future, but to have a conversation about what future we do want to create. And on the right is an example of a speculative design by a young designer, Emmy Hacker, called Jogaz, in which the wearable turns the user into an elite athlete. And her website describes the backstory behind this technology and the marketing materials for it in its introduction in the year 2050. That's 2050. Again, she's bringing this to our attention not because she expects it to happen, but to have a conversation about what it means to have augmented capabilities. And then my own book with Charles, in which idochronisms now are used very specifically for crafting a desired future. So with presumptive design, we use artifacts to drive research so that we can better figure out what future is embodied in these sketches. So I'm challenging you to shift your thinking about those sketches that you have in your notebook and challenging you to think about the future not as a road that stretches out in front of us, but as a thing that's already in our hands in front of us. I want you to change your thinking about the future from a what if to a what is. That's an important cognitive shift so that you can make this tool successful. In that opening moment in the clip, Marty McFly utters an apparent gaffe. "This is an oldie," he says. Because for him, it had been around his entire life. And then he realizes that for this audience, they'd never heard it. The sketches that are in your notebook, idochronisms, must be treated as if they already exist in your reality. And when offered to your audience, they buy into that hallucination. And in buying into that, you now discover what it is that doesn't make sense about that future from their perspective, which you can then leverage to turn that into a more desirable future. So I again say, we go outside of this theater, we see bits of clay and metal behind glass, and we say, yeah, that exists, and it existed 1,200 years ago, and it meant something to that culture 1,200 years ago. Gee, I wonder what it meant. So too with idochronisms. So let me give you a couple of examples. These are in the book. I'm not going to go over the narrative that's in the book. I'm going to talk about them a little differently. And the first has to do with a conference that I co-chaired back in 2004, in which we were studying how different types of designers work together. So we had interaction designers and we had industrial designers, and we were running this workshop for 2 days to try and figure out how those folks might start to work together. And we posed a design challenge to them, the intelligent pill dispenser, which was a kind of a common design challenge in the 2000s. It's still a big problem today. It hasn't really been solved. Now, this is not from that workshop. This is Vincent Berkeley Chen's concept that came much later, like 2008. But it is my belief that all of the attendees in that workshop were thinking about this object. It's got receptacles for pills, it's got a digital component to help assist in knowing what pills to take, and it's got various use case modes to help manage when to take those pills. To the best of my knowledge, this has never been built. This is a concept piece. So let me set the stage for you. 40 of us of mixed design capabilities descend on an assisted living facility to talk with 10 elderly women. There were men there, but they didn't want to play. 75 years old and older. And I've worked with a lot of tough customers. But I'm telling you, 80-year-old women do not have a lot of time left on this planet, and they don't have a lot of time for fools. So we walked in, and some of the teams had brought their sketches with them. And when the backlash came back and the blowback came back from these women, they just set them aside and reverted back to their usual one-on-one ethnographic interviews. Because this takes courage, and they weren't ready for that. This is the sketch that they had created, one or two of the teams had created, and you can see sort of the principle 3 at work. Right? The receptacles from Chen's proposal you can kind of see there on the right, and the dispenser you can sort of see on the left. That, when offered to these elders, became an anachronism. But the teams were completely routed. They just couldn't face it, and they dropped it. Thankfully, the women were extremely gracious and gave us an enormous amount of information in spite of our inability to field the anachronisms correctly. The second example is also in the book, and I bring it up because at least this looks like the thing that we were talking about. But in this next example, principle 3 comes in really hot and completely destroys any form that might look like the eventual future object. So we were approached, my design team was approached by a technical team. They had found a great technology stack. They wanted to stand this technology stack up. It was going to solve collaboration in the enterprise. And they had 16 of these atomized collaboration capabilities. Think IM, email, file repository, telephone video, file, whatever. They had a bunch of these things. And what they wanted to know was, what would the user experience be like if users were offered this palette of micro-collaborative technologies and could snap them together as they saw fit? So I gave it to the team. And I checked in with them a couple days later. And they said, oh, we're kind of working on the wireframes. I said, no. I said, you can do this with a carton of hard-boiled eggs. And the lead looked at me, and he said, don't you think the users will think we've grown a second head if we give them a carton of hard-boiled eggs? And this is where your courage as a manager needs to come in. And you need to say, damn the torpedoes, we're going to go ahead with a carton of hard-boiled eggs, which one of my team members knew me well enough to say, I got it, boss. And the sweet thing about this particular anachronism is it took her 2 hours to build, 6 hours to field, and 2 to 3 days to get the data back. And what the data told us was, yeah, people will snap together an experience based on atomistic collaborative technologies. Sure. But they expect it to do the following. Bada boom, bada bum, bada boom. And they listed a whole bunch of stuff that was supposed to happen, which was not baked into the technology stack, and when we did the analysis, looked like it was going to take at least as much effort to stand up as the technology stack. And so we said to the technical team, if you stand this up without these other capabilities, nobody's going to adopt this. And so the business had to step back and say, is this worth it? Are we prepared to go down that road? So that's the power of this tool. You can do these interventions very, very early and actually have an impact on the business's strategy and on the eventual outcome so that you can make these futures more highly likely to occur. Now, some of you might be thinking that anachronisms are nothing more than rough prototypes, but I want to assure you they are nothing at all the same. Prototypes are revisions and refinements of a solution to a putative problem. We have the problem and we're trying to get to a resolution to it. But anachronisms already exist. The problem's already been solved sometime in the future. What we're trying to figure out is, what the hell is the problem? We don't know what that problem is. There's a clue, it's in our notebooks, somehow it came out, but we don't know exactly what it is. And so our challenge is to tease that meaning out of these sketches, and we have to do that with an audience. If you situate this in the UK Design Council's double diamond diagram, prototypes occur here. And in our conversations with Jared Spool, he sort of was on the rampage about the fact that prototypes are part of the solution space. They aren't really addressing necessarily the problem space. I like to say, because Lewis Carroll is one of my favorite authors, that prototyping is the Red Queen's race. Right? Red Queen says to Alice, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. Prototyping, we know prototyping is a fantastic assistive process to get us to a better solution, but we're under the gun, we're on the clock. We have to get through these things as quickly as possible so that we can get to that solution. Anachronisms, on the other hand, take a page out of the White Queen's notebook because she lives backwards. She's already experienced this thing. And they are situated in the left-hand side. And this is where strategy occurs. This is where you have the opportunity to influence the design brief. So when your client, or inside your own organization, when another constituent inside your organization declares that there's a problem, you have the opportunity to actually vet whether there is a problem or whether it's the right problem by starting with an artifact that has been designed specifically to find out about the future of that problem. And it's really fast, and it's really cheap. So I would prefer to make my clients happier by saying, that was an interesting problem. We figured out that that problem isn't necessarily the most profitable problem to address. There's this other problem that we're finding has perhaps more value. And we've figured that out for a very little amount of money, as opposed to accepting without question that the client has said, this is the problem. Okay, boss, and off we go and spend a considerable amount of resources and time only to discover 6 sprints in that maybe we're not actually addressing the right problem. I would prefer not to tell the client we discovered that late in the game. I don't even know how much time I've got. But we're finishing up. Telling our clients that they might not be solving the right problem is a very difficult conversation to have. I'm going to leave that for another talk. But I do want to throw down the challenge to you. In the next few weeks or months, as you begin a project and you find yourself sketching some ideas about what the resolution to that problem might be, that you actually take those sketches with very little embellishment and very little effort and put them in front of either your own users, if you're in the enterprise, or your client's users as quickly as possible. And I'd like you to get in touch with me and tell me what your experience has been. Or, if you're interested in help, please reach out, because I'd love to help you do that. If your experience is anything like mine has been for the last several years, I think that you and your client are going to discover things about the future that neither of you had ever dreamed of or predicted. So, thank you very much for the opportunity to share.
Cake was a very useful thing to have, wasn't it?
What?
Cake.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. That was a bit of a mind-bending of a presentation. Do you know what? I think you and Kerry have just bent my mind into a new shape, which is good. New shapes are good, Joe. Who has a question for
We do have
Leo?
5 minutes.
Yeah, we have time.
Oh, look, they're gobsmacked. It's like the audience from Back to the Future. Go ahead.
I'm just trying to understand the relationship between an anachronism, but also diegetic prototypes. Because diegetic prototypes often, they're not necessarily solving a problem, and maybe they don't intend to be a provocation, but I don't know, like, what do you...
So I'm unfamiliar with that term, diegetic prototype, so I apologize. I can't speak to that. But by virtue of them not being provocations, they are not idochronisms. Idochronisms are designed to provoke, much like speculative design. They are designed to provoke a conversation about the future. Unlike speculative design, it is with the intention of designing a better future. Whereas speculative design says, isn't this curious? Who are we today? What do we value? Presumptive design, and by implication, idochronisms say, isn't this a great thing that we're proposing? And the users usually say, not really. Oh, why not? And so we get into a conversation about what's so bad about this with the expectation and desire to learn more about what would be good. Okay. I know I'm between you and your beer, but if anybody else has any question, I'm happy to take one more and then talk over alcohol. Yeah?
I think you just put a whole design framework behind the phrase that I've always loved as a child. When Doc says, we've got to get back to the future. That's never been wasted on me, but you've kind of gone,
Exactly.
super cool. Well, we're going to go for drinks now. We're going to put our hands together for Leo.
Thank you.
David.
Thank you.